was a cold, rain-drenched evening when Henry Collins, a man whose life had been marked by bitterness and cold indifference, encountered a situation that would irrevocably change the course of his existence. Henry was a solitary figure, a man of rigid routines and harsh opinions. His life had been one long story of isolation, and there was one thing he had always been certain of: his loathing for dogs. They were noisy, messy, and uncontrollable, symbols of a world that didn't fit his exacting sense of order. His hatred wasn't born from any direct trauma, but rather an ingrained belief that the world was better off without them. They were nothing but pests that disrupted his carefully curated life. For years, Henry walked through his quiet neighborhood, avoiding the dogs with a palpable scowl, often crossing the street just to avoid walking past one. The sight of a dog wagging its tail or barking in excitement filled him with a quiet fury, and his disdain for them only deepened with time. His apartment was devoid of any warmth or affection. No pictures on the walls, no plants, no reminders of anything that might evoke the joys of life. It was a space as cold and sterile as his heart. One evening, as the city streets turned slick with rain and the pale light of street lamps cast long shadows, Henry made his way home from work. The city was quieter than usual, the usual buzz muffled by the heavy downpour. The sound of his boots tapping against the wet pavement was the only noise that accompanied him. As he turned the corner near his building, something caught his attention, a faint whimper, a sound that didn't belong in the dark, echoing silence of the street. At first, Henry thought it might be another stray dog, one of the many that wandered the city, scavenging for scraps and making their lives in the shadows. He tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, soft, desperate. It tugged at something deep inside him, though he couldn't understand why. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he stopped and turned toward the alley where the sound seemed to be coming from. There, in the dim light, he saw it, a small, trembling puppy, no older than a few months, lying in a puddle, its tiny body shaking from the cold and pain. The puppy's fur was matted with dirt, and its little body was covered in cuts and bruises, as though it had been abandoned or attacked. Its eyes, wide with fear, flicked up to meet Henry's gaze, and for a moment they shared a silent understanding. The puppy was in pain, desperate for help, and yet it didn't run. Instead, it waited, helpless, as if it knew this was its last chance for survival. Henry stood frozen, staring at the creature before him. A mixture of annoyance and guilt surged through him. He had never been one to show compassion, especially not for a creature he had spent his whole life resenting. But as he watched the puppy struggle to lift its head, a strange and foreign feeling began to stir within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years: empathy. It was a feeling so out of place that he tried to dismiss it, telling himself that it wasn't his responsibility, that the dog would probably die anyway, and that he didn't need to get involved. But as the puppy whimpered once more, its small body trembling in the rain, something inside Henry shifted. He didn't know why, but he couldn't walk away. He knelt down slowly, unsure of what he was doing, and gently reached out. The puppy flinched at first, but didn't try to run away. With trembling hands, Henry carefully lifted the small animal, feeling the heat of its tiny body against his palm. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its breathing was labored, but it was alive. Alive, and in desperate need of help. Henry cursed under his breath as he stood up, holding the puppy close to his chest, and began walking toward his apartment. He had no idea what he was doing. He wasn't equipped to care for a dog, let alone one that was injured. But something inside him told him that this puppy was not just any dog. It was a soul in need, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't leave it behind. When he arrived at his apartment, Henry placed the puppy on his kitchen table, looking around in confusion. What was he supposed to do now? He had no pet supplies, no bandages, no idea how to help an injured animal. He didn't even know where to start. But as he looked into the puppy's eyes, those deep, pleading eyes that seemed to search his soul, he realized that he couldn't turn away. He needed to do something, anything, to save it. After a moment of hesitation, Henry grabbed his phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. The local animal shelter. A calm voice answered, and Henry quickly explained the situation. Within minutes, a volunteer arrived at his door, bringing with them a kit to tend to the puppy's wounds. The puppy was examined, cleaned, and bandaged, and Henry was instructed to keep it warm and comfortable overnight. The volunteer left, but Henry stayed, sitting by the puppy's side as it slept soundly on a pile of old towels. As he watched the small creature's chest rise and fall, a profound sense of responsibility washed over him. He realized, in that quiet moment, that he had just made the first decision in his life that wasn't dictated by his own selfishness. He had chosen to help, even when it went against everything he believed. In the days that followed, Henry's life changed in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He found himself researching how to care for a puppy, reading books on dog breeds and health, and calling the shelter daily to check on the puppy's progress. The bond between him and the small creature grew stronger with each passing day, and Henry began to realize that the puppy was not just an animal, it was a companion, a friend, someone who needed him as much as he needed it. As the weeks went by, the puppy, whom he had named Max, began to heal. Its once dull eyes now shone with energy and life, and its playful spirit began to return. Henry started taking Max on walks, something he had never considered before. Slowly but surely, the world that Henry had shut out for so long began to open up again. He smiled more, laughed more, and found himself caring for something other than himself. Max became his constant companion, following him everywhere, and in return, Henry found a sense of purpose he had never known. Months later, Henry stood in the park with Max by his side, watching the puppy, now a full-grown dog, chase after a ball, its tail wagging in pure joy. The dog's exuberance was contagious, and Henry couldn't help but laugh, realizing just how much his life had changed. He had gone from a man who hated dogs, who lived in a world of bitterness and isolation, to a man who had learned to love and care for an animal, who had found in that small puppy the companionship and warmth he had never known. As he stood there watching Max play, Henry couldn't help but reflect on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. He had been ready to walk away, ready to dismiss the puppy as just another stray, but instead, he had made the choice to care. And in doing so, he had found a bond that would last a lifetime. A bond that had not only saved the puppy's life, but had saved his as well. Henry realized that sometimes the things we fear most are the very things that have the power to heal us. He had hated dogs all his life, and yet it was a dog, a wounded, helpless puppy, that had taught him how to love again. And in that love, he had found a piece of himself he never knew was missing. From the moment Mark cradled the tiny, trembling puppy in his arms, everything in his life seemed to change. The bitterness he had long carried, stemming from a childhood where dogs were always seen as pests and a symbol of chaos, began to soften. In the weeks that followed, Mark's once solitary, rigid life started to take on a new warmth, like the slow burn of a fire kindling in the coldest of winters. Each day he would wake up to find the small creature curled up next to him, its soft breathing a constant reminder of the unexpected shift in his life. He named the puppy Charlie, though it was a name that never quite fit with the tough, guarded person Mark had been. At first, it felt odd, almost foreign, to care for something so small, so vulnerable. But soon, that vulnerability became something beautiful to him, a gentle kind of power. Charlie was a rescue, and the puppy had known fear before it found Mark. But with time, the bond between the two grew, and the hurt that had been woven into both their pasts seemed to disappear like a fading storm. The walls around Mark's heart began to crumble, piece by piece, until it felt almost natural to laugh when Charlie clumsily ran around the house, his legs too long for his body, tripping over his own paws. Mark had never been the type to show affection, not even to people. But Charlie's innocence was a force Mark couldn't resist. The way Charlie looked at him with those wide, brown eyes filled with nothing but trust was enough to make Mark feel something he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility, love, a purpose that went beyond just surviving. But it wasn't just the joy that Charlie brought to Mark's life. It was the challenge, too. Charlie had been sick when Mark found him. The malnourished little pup was covered in sores, shivering in the alleyway as though he had given up. Mark had taken him in not knowing if the dog would survive. But through the endless nights of tending to Charlie's wounds and giving him medication, something changed He saw in Charlie's struggles the very same battles he had been fighting quietly for years: loneliness, fear, and the desperate need to belong somewhere, to have something to protect. As the days passed, Charlie's health improved. Mark began to notice that the little pup had an uncanny way of responding to him, as if understanding his moods. When Mark was feeling particularly down, Charlie would nudge his hand with his nose, silently asking for attention. If Mark was angry, Charlie would sit by his feet, staring up at him, as though to say, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." That was all Mark needed. The mere presence of the dog grounded him in a way nothing else had. He began to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't meant to go through life alone after all. But as with every relationship, there were hurdles. In a city that viewed dogs as little more than noisy, messy creatures, Mark's newfound love for his dog was met with scorn by others. His neighbors, who had long judged him for his reclusive behavior, whispered behind his back when they saw him walking Charlie. They laughed at the sight of a man who had once been so cold and unapproachable, now doting on a dog as if it was a child. At work, people joked about Mark's new family member, with a few even making comments about how soft he was becoming. Yet, Mark was different now. The comments and sneers didn't bother him as they once would have. It wasn't just because he had Charlie by his side. It was because he realized something important. He no longer cared what others thought. For the first time in his life, he was genuinely living for himself, for the quiet moments of peace that Charlie had brought into his world. It was his connection with this small, innocent creature that allowed him to see the world differently, a world that was, despite all the chaos and negativity, still capable of kindness. There were nights when Mark would sit on his couch, Charlie curled up beside him, the soft rhythm of his breathing filling the silence. He would often reflect on the things he had lost in his life, his family, his friends, the dream he had given up on long ago. But with Charlie, it didn't feel like the end of the road. It felt like a second chance, an opportunity to rewrite his story, even if it was one small moment at a time. One cold autumn evening, as Mark and Charlie were taking their usual walk through the park, something unexpected happened. Charlie, who had always been the calm, obedient puppy, suddenly pulled away from Mark's side, barking excitedly at something in the distance. Mark, startled by his dog's sudden burst of energy, quickly ran to catch up. When he reached the spot where Charlie had stopped, he found himself face to face with another dog, a large, wild-looking creature that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The dog was unlike anything Mark had ever seen before. It was a wolf, standing tall and proud, with piercing amber eyes that glinted in the moonlight. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Mark felt a rush of fear, but then something strange happened. The wolf, instead of being hostile, lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging Charlie's presence. "Charlie, usually so friendly and playful with every dog he met, stood still, watching the wolf with a sense of quiet respect. Mark was transfixed. He had heard stories about wolves, about their wild nature and untamed spirit, but never had he seen one so close. This was no ordinary encounter. The air between the two dogs felt thick with a bond, a silent communication that neither Mark nor the wolf's presence could break. The wolf, sensing the peace in the air, turned and walked back into the shadows of the park, leaving Mark and Charlie standing there, side by side. For days, Mark couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. It felt like a moment that had shifted something deep within him, a connection to something older, something wild. Perhaps it was a reminder of the things he had once rejected, the untamed parts of himself he had buried under the weight of his past. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was a sign that he was no longer alone in the world, that even in the darkest corners, there were connections waiting to be made. But life, as always, had its challenges. Mark's emotional journey with Charlie was only just beginning. As the dog grew older, he began to show signs of aging. His playful energy began to wane, and his once boundless enthusiasm was replaced with a calm wisdom. Mark could feel the changes in his dog, and it made him realize something he had been avoiding, the inevitable. One day, Charlie would be gone, and that day came sooner than Mark had expected. As the days turned into weeks, the slow but steady decline in Charlie's health became undeniable. Mark had noticed the signs. The once exuberant puppy who had chased after sticks with a joy that lit up his entire world was now growing sluggish, his movements slower and more deliberate. It was subtle at first, just a slight hesitation when jumping onto the couch, or a brief pause when climbing the stairs. But these small changes were enough for Mark to recognize them, to feel the weight of what was coming. Time, it seemed, was running out. Mark had always feared this moment, the deep, gnawing fear that one day he would have to face the truth that Charlie, his faithful companion, wouldn't be there anymore. The thought was paralyzing. And yet, it was something that had always lingered at the back of his mind, just waiting for the right moment to step forward and shatter the peace they had built together. The idea of living without Charlie was like staring into an abyss, a void so dark, so vast, that Mark couldn't imagine how he would ever fill it. But in the weeks leading up to the inevitable, something extraordinary happened. Charlie's health continued to decline, but Mark found himself embracing it in a way he never expected. Instead of fearing the end, he began to cherish every moment, every small act of kindness that Charlie showed him. It was as if the dog understood what was happening, as if he was somehow giving Mark the courage he needed to face the unknown. Charlie became even more protective, more gentle, always by Mark's side, never leaving him for a second. One evening, as the sun began to set, and the cool breeze of autumn swept through the trees, Mark sat on the porch of his house with Charlie curled up in his lap. The dog's breathing was shallow, and Mark could feel the warmth of his small body. But there was a certain weight to it that made him realize just how fragile this moment was. They were no longer two separate beings. They were connected, intertwined in a bond that transcended the physical. In that quiet moment, Mark understood something profound, that the love they had shared was not defined by time or by the physical presence of the dog. It was something deeper, something eternal. As the night fell, a strange calmness enveloped them both. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the city fading into the background as if they were in a world all their own. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt at peace. He knew that Charlie's time was coming to an end, but in that peace, he realized something even more important, that the love they had shared was a gift, one that had changed him forever. No longer was he the bitter, solitary man who had once scorned the companionship of a dog. He was someone different now, someone who had learned to open his heart, to embrace love, and to find joy in the simplest moments. And then, one cold, quiet morning, it happened. Mark woke up to find Charlie lying beside him, his little body still and unmoving. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Mark's heart caught in his throat as he gently reached down to touch Charlie's fur. The warmth was gone, and in that instant, Mark knew. The pain was immediate, sharp, and overwhelming. The realization that Charlie was gone hit him like a wave, crashing over him, sweeping away everything in its path. But amidst the pain, Mark felt a strange sense of relief. Charlie was no longer in pain, no longer suffering. He had been with Mark until the very end, just as he had promised all those months ago. Mark took a deep breath, holding back the tears that threatened to spill over. He wasn't ready to let go, but he knew he had to. It was time. In the days that followed, Mark found himself grappling with the weight of his grief. It wasn't something he could escape or avoid. It settled over him like a heavy cloak, wrapping him in sorrow. But even in the midst of the pain, there was a sense of gratitude, a quiet understanding that Charlie had given him more than he had ever asked for. The little dog had taught him how to love, how to trust, and how to open his heart to something greater than himself. He had given Mark a reason to live, a reason to smile, and a reason to believe in the goodness of the world. Mark knew that Charlie's passing would leave a hole in his heart, a hole that would never truly heal. But he also knew that he would carry the lessons the dog had taught him for the rest of his life. The love they had shared, the bond they had built, would remain with him forever, etched into the very fabric of his being. As the months passed, Mark found a way to honor Charlie's memory. He planted a small garden in the backyard, a patch of earth where flowers could bloom in remembrance of the little puppy who had changed his life. Every time he looked at the garden, he thought of Charlie, his soft eyes, his playful nature, and the unconditional love he had given. Mark's heart still ached with the loss, but it was a bittersweet ache, one that came with the knowledge that the love they had shared was something worth celebrating, not something to be mourned endlessly. One evening, as Mark stood in front of the garden, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a strange sensation. It was as if Charlie's spirit was still with him, watching over him, guiding him. The warmth of the evening breeze seemed to carry the echoes of the dog's presence, and for a moment, Mark felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. Charlie had taught him that love wasn't about possession or ownership. It was about giving and receiving, about trusting and being trusted, about sharing moments of joy and sorrow. Mark had learned to love not just the dog, but himself, too, and in doing so, he had found a way to move forward, to live a life that was richer and more fulfilling than he had ever imagined. As the years went by, Mark continued to live in the house they had shared, surrounded by the memories of his beloved dog. Every corner of the house held a piece of Charlie's spirit, his toys, his favorite blanket, the photographs of their time together. But the most important thing Mark had learned from his time with Charlie was that love didn't end with death. It lived on in the stories we tell, in the memories we cherish, and in the hearts of those who have loved Mark. Once a man who had closed himself off from the world, had been transformed. He had learned that love, true love, was about acceptance, understanding, and the willingness to open your heart to something or someone greater than yourself. Charlie, in his own way, had shown Mark the beauty of life, the depth of emotion, and the power of connection. And so, even in the absence of the little dog who had changed his life, Mark knew that he would never be alone. Charlie would always be with him, in his heart, in his memories, and in the lessons he had learned.